Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for bearing with me again. I'm always surprised that people like to talk about governance and rules, all those sorts of things. So thank heavens that you do. So we're going to talk just another quick recap of the changes that are coming through for associations. And even though we talked about that at the conference and we've done already one workshop on it, I'm just going to take everyone through, assuming there might be some people that haven't seen that information before. I want to talk about managing some difficult behaviours with U3A and give you some ideas and suggestions about that because it relates to some of the changes to the law. I'm going to take you through the new assessments that you'll have to do from 2023 for the tax office. And we'll talk more about that. We're going to talk a little bit about getting ready for audits and your AGM. And then finally talk about doing some checklists that will just help you to make sure you're doing everything that you need to do. So hopefully we both understand that's what we're all here to do. Let's talk about some of the changes, but there were some changes that came through to the the Associations Incorporations Act in 2020, last year, the first one started. And then there's more changes this year. The bulk of them have already come in now. And then there's a few changes next year. So one of the questions I had is, has this gone to assent yet? And the 2 additional years haven't, but the way the legislation's been written is that these changes that I'm going to talk to you about, and I'll tell you when we get there, some of them just only have to happen before the end of June 2022. Okay, so common seals will be optional from the end of this year moving forward. You can keep your common seal or you can choose not to have one. And it will also allow associations to execute contracts without using the common seal. Previous to now, you had to do that. So that's actually a good change, I think, and it's not too much of a big one. I would say I had a U3A contact me. All of you may not be aware that we've got a template constitution that we prepared for U3As, including these changes, so that by the time they come through, you're ready. But the wording that I put in it said, for example, you may have to have a common seal depending on the legislation. And unfortunately, one of the U3As took away that important second half of the sentence. So it just said you don't have to have a common seal. But then they lodged it before 30 June this year, so it got declined because prior to 30 June, you did have to have one. So if you are using the template constitution that I've done, you're always welcome throughout the year to send me a copy where you've just highlighted what you've changed, and then I can come straight back to you and say, that's okay or that's not okay, so that you don't get stuck in that loop of thinking you've done the right thing and you haven't. And then you have to have another general meeting and it's all a bit of a mess. So the next change to the Act is that the secretary has to be 18 years or older. Again, that probably was always the case, but they've just put it in the legislation now. The duties of the management committee are changing quite a bit. And for those of you that have a legal bent, if you go to look at the actual legislation, the Incorporated Associations legislation, it won't say these things because there's another piece of legislation which is the one that was approved by Parliament, and that's the Amending Act. So I'll send you details in a link to look at both pieces of legislation, just in case someone says, oh, I looked at that legislation online and that's not how it works. A few more on those changes. So you now have to disclose material personal interests if you're on the management committee. So these are the biggest changes that are coming through. So if you feel you've got a conflict of interest or someone else on the committee has either got a material interest, a personal interest, or a conflict of interest, there are some rules around it. And basically what they are is, as soon as you're aware of a conflict, you have to declare it and let everybody know that. And then the rest of the members can make a decision about whether you can retain a vote or not. Where you have a material personal interest in something that's being discussed at a meeting, you can't be present. So, so in those situations where you stand to benefit by a decision that's being made, and in U3A, that might look something like we're really struggling to get people on the management committee. So we are going to offer everybody on the management committee free entry to 5 workshops of their choice. Well, then everybody on the committee would have a conflict of interest on that because they're all going to benefit personally. You can even actually go ahead and make those decisions, but you just have to make sure you minute that everyone's had a conflict or that someone has had a conflict. A little bit more on changes to the management committee in this legislation. You've got a duty of care and due diligence, and they've just clarified that. So what a reasonable person would do, they'd expect you to do. You've got a duty of good faith, and that just means you've got to believe in the decisions that you're making. You have to ask questions, be good guardians of your organisation. And finally, you can't use confidential information you might have for your own benefit. So in U3As, I suppose, you know, that could be where perhaps there's an artist who's disclosed the amount that they charge for a piece, for example, and you also make pieces like that. So then you change your price list so that you're in line with theirs. I mean, you could do that commercially anyway, but this is more just about not using information that you might be privy to in ways that are for your benefit. Now, this is an interesting one. I think it's a good change. So this is the law now saying that from 2023 onwards, your financial report, your audit, will have to show if you're paying your management committee anything. So, you know, those of you that have heard me before will know that I've said many times that I believe volunteers should be rewarded more and more often, particularly because it's getting harder to get them. So I think volunteers should be rewarded, but we now just have to have a separate line in our financials. So if you said everyone on the management committee this year, we're just going to give them $200 as just a recognition that they use their own phones, their own computers, their own petrol, their own everything, then you would just have a simple line in your audited financials that says, well, there's 10 of us and everybody got $200, so $2,000 has gone to the management committee.
Excuse me, Leisa.
Yes.
What happens where perhaps you reimburse somebody for expenses that they've incurred?
That's a good question, Gail. If it's just a reimbursement of expenses, it doesn't go in that section. Just means someone's actually paid it themselves and come back and ask for the money. And that's absolutely fine to keep doing that. Another better solution to doing that might be that there are some people in the U3A who are given one of those prepaid debit Visa cards. And at least that way you can limit your risks. So maybe you only put a couple of $100 on the card or $1,000 on the card, whatever you think's appropriate. And then they treat it like a credit card. They have to provide receipts, but at least they're not using their own money. Because I would imagine that, like most organisations, there'll be people for whom spending, you know, $50 or $100 isn't a problem, and others who would really struggle to be able to do that. So better to ask them or give them the opportunity to use the organisation's money rather than claim it back. Going back to some of these changes, there's a duty to keep your financial records. And the duty isn't just on the treasurer, it's on all of the management committee to make sure that the financial records are kept and that they're kept up to date. Let's just go down then to that. There are some defences. So the theme of this is it's really bringing associations into line with companies, and they're saying, essentially, aside from one or two little things like the common seal, you have to be very open and accountable. And the other big change, of course, is that you have to have a complaints procedure. We'll talk about that when we go on to managing difficult behaviour. But if things do go wrong, they've also given us a bit of advice around, how you might be able to defend yourself if something's changed. So what they're saying is that if you make a business judgment and you've done that showing due care and diligence, so you've investigated something, you've decided, okay, well, I think it's going to work, but it just doesn't work, then that's a defence. And this is particularly around insolvency. So they've really tightened up how far you can go with an association and paying bills when you've run out of money, which is really not very far at all anymore. And so you can use a business judgment as a defence. If you've relied on information that's been given to you by someone else, that's a defence as well, an allowable defence. So let's say someone's provided comprehensive financial reports, but they've missed out $5,000 of expenditure and you made a decision based on that, then that would be a defence. So I guess it's good news in that they're not saying we're not going to be reasonable and there's a hard and fast rule. And so you don't need to panic too much. And then still on the changes within that act, insolvent trading defence. So if you haven't had enough money to pay the bills you've got and then you go and incur more bills, you're allowed to say that essentially if someone has then incurred a debt and not told the rest of you about it, then that's going to be on them. That's their responsibility. You won't hold responsibility for that. But it is one of the reasons why I like to change constitutions to say that the model rules, for example, say with the incursion of debt that expenses or payments have to be approved at a committee meeting. But that can be, and it usually is after the debt's been incurred. I always like to change a constitution to say that expenditure has to be approved at a management committee meeting before it's actually spent. Otherwise, you end up with some nasty conversations around why someone's gone and bought a whole lot of stuff and you didn't know they were going to. So there are some financial reporting changes that I've already talked to you about. And just to let you all know, because U3As are unique little beasts sometimes. So some of you are just incorporated associations, some of you are registered charities, and some of you might be incorporated associations with the permission to raise funds, which is different to being a charity. So generally, if you're registered with the ACNC, you don't have to worry about these because you'll just duplicate your financial reporting anyway. And then finally, you need an internal grievance policy, which you've got an excellent internal committee with Network who's really reviewed grievance procedure for you all to use as a basis. So if you're not sure about that, I'd get in touch with Network and maybe we can send out a copy with the notes of this workshop as well. But that's definitely one of the takeaways from today. If you don't have a grievance procedure yet, that is something that you should focus on this coming year. And I'll take you through, not the whole grievance procedure because we've already done a workshop on that, but just, I guess, the importance of using it when you do get into trouble. So, right. How can you get ready? Well, you should be reviewing those governance arrangements. So for me, the two big get readies, have a look at your constitution, ask for the template, and it will solve most of these regulatory problems for you. So you don't have to update it again every year as things change. And then finally, have a look at that complaints procedure. And if you do those two things, maybe review this workshop with the rest of your committee, then you'll be prepared. And the other thing is, that keep calm and carry on. Don't panic. If you are still not sure, I think I recorded the last session. I'll talk to Gail about whether I sent that through and how you can find it, and it'll take you through more detail. So thinking about the new changes that are coming through. This is just a link, I beg your pardon. So what you can see on the screen now is the Office of Fair Trading's website. It's got some excellent information. So in the presentation I'm going to send out, there'll be links where you can just click on this slide and it will take you through to the actual website. But you can see all of the details there, and it's explained quite simply and easily to guide you through as well. But again, if you get stuck, you can always email me. That's a part of our deal between U3A and I, that I'm happy to help or provide some more information if you do get stuck. Well, assuming nobody in U3A ever misbehaves, this might be useful to you in another area of your volunteering life. But you'll see that now you're required to have a complaints policy or a complaints procedure. And a condition within that complaints procedure has to be mediation. You need to make some decisions about how far down the road a complaint has to get before you go into mediation. And my advice is always to try and manage it in a different way before you get there. So let's spend just a little bit of time here on how to manage, I guess, bad behaviour in all different areas in your U3A. That might be, it might be if you're having problems with volunteers, or if it's just members, maybe it's fellow management committee team members, all of those things. I guess my first observation would be that sometimes with some people, a little bit of information is dangerous, and often even people with the very best intentions might have misunderstood something or become suspicious of something, and then it can get really tricky and awful. I'll take you through just a few of the common personalities that cause problems in not-for-profit organisations and try and give you a solution to actually help you deal with them. So control freaks, and I think every organisation has these, and a lot of us who are volunteers recognise these character traits. And that is where you really only want volunteers to do exactly what you want them to do and nothing else. They're often the people who, for what they think are the very best reasons, block change or new ideas, and they're not very keen on being flexible about how people do things. None of those things speak to modern volunteering. Modern volunteering, what's left of it, is all about giving people the authority and knowledge to make changes themselves and do their job in a way that they want to do it, so long as it gets done. But it can be hard, and there's all those sorts of lies that we tell ourselves about being control freaks. Another one is a roadblock. These are people who just they consider any questions about how they're doing what they're doing as you interfering, rather than that you've got a role or a responsibility to make sure everything's being done properly. They might keep information to themselves, and that's really holding on to power for whatever reason. They don't like to train others. And they can also become difficult within your organisation. A group of volunteers in the wrong place can also cause conflict. And that's, again, just having, I suppose, not having a leader. It's impossible to have a group of volunteers or members and not have an identified leader. It just doesn't work. So you need someone in charge of everything that you do, who's ultimately the person in authority and makes decisions, because otherwise other people will get frustrated. And the example I generally give is, I don't know, you turn up to help at a morning tea and someone tells you to make sandwiches, and then someone else yells at you because there's too many sandwiches. And so you stop making sandwiches, and then someone gets cranky because you haven't buttered the bun loaf. I don't know. I'm sure that U3A has its own version of when you're doing anything and there's just no one clearly in charge. I'm sad to say that there's more and more of this sort of feral behaviour in volunteering. I've had some very extreme examples. Talking about canteens, once somebody ordered a burger and a Coke, and I put it on a tray and gave it to him, and he threw the whole thing on me because I'd forgot to leave the onions off. And so that's one example, but it's really where you've got someone in the membership or someone in the volunteer body who thinks they can say whatever they want just because they're a volunteer. So somehow their willingness to work for free, which we do value, allows them to just not have to be subject to the rules of normal human behaviour. And they might feel really justified in expressing their opinion, but it's problematic and really difficult to deal with. And then there's the dead horse flogger. I was in a meeting yesterday, actually, and one of the things I wrote down was, Leisa, stop flogging dead horses, because we were having a really good conversation about how tired we all were and how, because there's not enough of us, we just get given more and more and more to do all the time. And it doesn't feel like we're valued. So it's very important that we ourselves don't get caught in this kind of idea that, okay, there's a group of 5 people who always work really hard. And so as a reward for being reliable and working hard, what do? Well, we give them more to do. Or we might have one volunteer that will always clean the toilets or that will always do the terrible job. And so how do we reward them? Usually not with giving them a cushy job the next week. We'll give them another set of toilets and maybe the kitchen and cleaning out the fridge. And so all of that really is about following up, making sure that you've got as many people as possible doing a little bit of the work, but then that in itself becomes a great big job as well. So for all of these sort of previous people that I've talked about, most of them, surprisingly, are not that hard to manage. There's some tools that you've already got. So there's some law around anti-harassment and anti-bullying and anti-discrimination that you have to be aware of. So people, bullying is one of those things. It's a word, unfortunately, that's becoming overused. And I think in overusing it, we're actually making it less powerful. Bullying under the law is a series of behaviours. It's not a one-off row with someone where words are flung about. It's continuous and repeated behaviour. And certainly that happens. That's one of those volunteers I was talking about earlier who's horrible to everyone. So there's some law saying you've got a responsibility to manage it. But the most important reason is that whenever there's conflict or someone out of hand, we measure the wrong thing, I think. I often hear clubs say to me, yeah, I know, look, she's horrible, but she's such a great volunteer. She's always there. She's always reliable. And so that's what we measure, that she never says no. But what we can't measure is how many other people will never volunteer because she's horrible, that particular person. And we don't see it. Where I see it is when we've moved a volunteer out and then you get a rush of new people come in and say, yes, of course I'll help. Now, they hardly ever say, we really, Carol was a nightmare. But there's always that rush when someone who I know has been problematic moves on. How do you move them on though? Well, that's where this complaints procedure that the Act is requiring from next year on, that's where that becomes really important. So you have to use the same system. And there is a real danger when you've been around for a long time and you know people and you have relationships that you'll say, well, you know, Pam's lovely and she's always told the truth. So if she tells me someone was mean to her, I'm going to believe her. But everybody knows Carol is the opposite of that. So I'm not even going to look at Carol's complaint. I'm going to ignore it. I understand the human response of that, but realistically, they all have to go through the same system. And perhaps people who don't know either of them should be making decisions about who's right and who's wrong. So think about using that template. It's quite simple and fair. Have really clear instructions for emergencies. For example, if something does go wrong, let's say Carol and Pam get into it and Pam punches Carol on the nose, then what happens? You need to have that in the policy. What happens in an emergency? Put together a contact tree so you always know who to contact if conflict gets out of control really quickly, and make sure you always use that same policy. I'll go on to a few meeting behaviours that I have struggled with and continue to struggle with because they actually indicate conflict in other areas. So if you think about your meetings, are there people who don't turn up to them? One of the things you might do there is bring in an attendance procedure. So some organisations might say you can only miss 2 meetings and then you're no longer on the committee automatically. Or there might be a version that says if you don't ask for leave and you miss 2 meetings, then you're automatically off. But having some rules is important. Otherwise, they're just a name on a page. Thinking about people who really don't do anything on committee, but maybe congratulate the people who are doing the work. There's someone I do want to punch on the nose a little bit, just a little bit. But I'll usually say, you know, John, I appreciate the recognition, but I'd appreciate it more if you helped me next time. I suppose the philosophy here, though, is making sure that everybody on your committee has got an actual job, that you've got a position description that you've defined for them. And even if you have people who join under your constitution as general committee members, they actually have a specific job that they're reporting on. Otherwise, it's too easy for them to really not contribute that much all year. Don't be too distracted with the idea that someone who's famous, even if it might just be in your small town, that they'll somehow be great committee members. They can be great for letting people know you exist or what your issues and challenges are, but they hardly ever are really big workers in your organisation. People who come to meetings and never say anything can be issues and creators of conflict in a couple of different ways. So, you know, I suppose what I would say, the few things I would say is someone in a workshop said to me, they're always good for a quorum, and that's true. I would prefer to have a lower quorum and have a whole group of people working equally hard. So a lot of these behaviours are around the politics of having people in the club that are working really hard, or people in the organisation who are working, and people who do nothing. Because for me, again, if there's 10 people on your committee and 4 are working really hard and 6 are doing nothing, but the Constitution says you have to have 10, I would rather you change the Constitution to say you have to have 4, and then you're just all working hard. Then at least you don't have the other 6 throwing grenades from the sidelines, if that's a problem for you. The other thing is, though, sometimes people don't talk in meetings because you're all really scary and more knowledgeable than they are. So a great chair will ask for everybody's input on everything that you're discussing. People who get a little bit too burrowed down into the detail, even though they would tell you, and it would be for the right reasons, they want you to follow the rules, sometimes they can be a problem as well because they just distract. You could spend 20 minutes talking about something that really isn't important. And then that's 20 minutes of my life I'll never get back, and I won't want to come to the meeting next time. But it's always a good idea to give them a job that they'd really love. So whenever people start quoting things like the Constitution to me, I'll generally say, that's awesome. It's actually due for a review. You seem very knowledgeable about what's in it and you're interested. So would you like to go away and come back with a review document for us to consider? Keeping everybody busy is the theme of this part of the presentation. Committee members who have been there for a long time can be very problematic as well. Not for every organisation. Some organisations can have presidents that have been there for 30 years and they're active and they're vibrant and they're great. My problem with these is always that issue that members will let you die in office rather than take on some of those roles themselves. So how do you handle all of that? It's not a problem. What am I trying to say here? It's not so much how long they've been on committee or they've been volunteering, not even on committee. They might even be life members. It's just how active they are and how open they are to considering new things, or are they just tired? All of those things can scare away new volunteers, and it's important to remember that. If you are a lifer, and I have been certainly, because in my head, no one can do it as well as I can. So, you know, why teach someone else to do it? Which is very bad thinking. I was being sarcastic then. I would be better. It's always better for people who know a lot about how to run the organisation are constantly teaching new people. Even if they don't do it the way that you want them to do it, so long as it gets done, it really doesn't matter how it's done. But there's some tools here that I think can make a difference if you're having problems getting rid of someone who's been in place for a long time. If you've done some ascendancy planning or succession planning, if you're really working on recruitment all the time to get new people flowing through, those things can really help get rid of that kind of conflict. You might have people in your organisation who you know are very sweet to you and say all the right things, and then you find out that they're saying quite the opposite once they leave the committee room, or they might be talking to, you know, someone in your organisation and saying the opposite to someone else. They're probably just annoying, but something I've done with those types of members or volunteers before is just to try and get them involved and put them in charge of the message, because then it can become a lot more positive. It's a scary thing to do, though, to put your biggest critic in charge of the newsletter. But the funny thing usually happens once it's their message that's going out, it'll be a bit more positive anyway. High risk strategy. And then backstabbers, or to more than one make a conspiracy. For me, really any kind of conflict, not just this, not hidden conflict, but whenever you're having problems with anybody in the organisation, the best advice I can give you is to talk to your management committee about it, even if it's someone on the management committee that you're in conflict with, and be open about it, be honest about it. If nothing else, they'll know that you won't tolerate, you know, that sort of behindhand comment, that passive aggressive kind of stuff that goes on, because that's awful too. It is supposed to be fun. Volunteering is supposed to be positive and fun. It's some days it just doesn't feel like that. You might have someone, particularly in meetings, but people who just don't stop talking, and you need a great chair who'll just shut that down really quickly. Once behaviour starts to escalate and people get a bit out of hand, and this can happen in the membership without volunteers or committee involved, they scare everyone away with their comments or the way that they are. I think you need to address that in the moment. If you're brave enough, anyone who's there and witnesses it has to say something. We have a real tendency sometimes to look in our laps and thank heaven that it isn't us that's under attack. But if you want to talk about a positive culture in your U3A, then everybody has to work to defend that. But for U3A, it's complex. I know at the conference you had other great presenters talking about these things, but it can be difficult with organisations involving older people to really understand what's going on with them, what's going on with their health, what's going on with their mental health, and with all sorts of things. So I imagine it isn't uncommon to, over the years of their involvement, have, you know, some people whose behaviour changes and they may not end up the person that they were when they came to you. But of course, that's a really important aim of U3A, to keep engaging with people like that. But it must also bring some challenges about how to be considerate of that behaviour. The balance there for me for U3A, though, is just understanding that you can be compassionate about someone's situation without being empowering to them of that behaviour. So, and that might mean that you have to have an open conversation with them at some point to say, well, you know, we all love you, but things are changing and you just you can't do the things that you're doing now. Finally, or almost finally, being a brick wall, and I talk about this all the time, just how frustrating it is for a new volunteer who's enthusiastic to try and get growth. There's so many of us are really comfortable in how our organisations run, but if you're running your U3A the same way you did 5 years ago, then you're not doing a great job at running your U3A. Everything changes all the time. What you want to do is keep the things that work and yearly review all the things that aren't working anymore and make some changes. So for all of those difficult behaviours, you know, we need you to be considerate, talk about it, try and come up with a solution, and if not, go to that policy and use that, the complaints procedure or policy. For people who are behaving very badly that you just can't work with, obviously you can tell them they're bullying and go through the processes within that document we've developed. But some other stuff from my life, always be completely honest. Don't worry too much. I mean, don't be outrageous, but don't worry too much about someone suing you for defamation. You're entitled to your opinion. You just can't say anything that isn't true. But if in your opinion someone's out of line, you're allowed to say that to them. Always communicate in writing if something's going on, and document every single time you talk to someone on the phone. Try finding someone that, when there's conflict between two people, try and find someone to be an intermediary between the two. If it's terrible and you just can't talk to anybody anymore, remember it's okay to just hang up the phone rather than get into a row. Lobby your committee and members. You can always go back to the members in conflict. Remember, it's the members who decide ultimately. So sometimes if I haven't been able to work something out, I've actually called a general meeting and gone back to them and said, guys, I don't know what to do. What should I do? And then once they decide in majority, you don't have to worry about it anymore. The members have spoken. So there's a few different options there, but you'll see the second from last is mediation. So mediation is a requirement of the law from July next year. And you should have a policy that talks about, if you have to go to mediation, who's going to pay for it? When do you go to mediation? If I'm unhappy and it's the first day I'm unhappy and I say I want mediation, have you got anything to say that I don't get it? I have to go through a whole process first. And that's what the U3A template says. There's a whole process to go through, and then mediation is one of those options. And don't forget, there's a whole lot of other documents that can provide assistance. And I've given you a list there. They might just give you some guidance on where to go. All right, well, looking at the biggest change, I guess, for this year, apart from the State Act, is this new changes to taxation. So you may not all know that the not-for-profit status isn't a given. Just because you're registered as an association or even registered as a charity, the fact that you don't have to pay company tax isn't automatic. It's only automatic for those organisations who are also registered as a charity with the ACNC. So for those of you on the call, and I know there are some, If you're registered with the ACNC, you don't need to worry about this for your U3A, but maybe you're involved in another organisation. I'm going to show you a few screenshots. It's a pretty simple process to go through, but from July 2023, you're all going to have to self-assess every year unless you're registered with ACNC. So you'll go to the website, and again, I'll give you the hot links here. It's pretty easy to find. There's a whole section in the middle here for not-for-profit. And then it will take you through how to do your annual assessment. So see over here, it says, do you have to pay income tax? So this is not you personally, but does your U3A have to pay company tax? And then when you go through, it will give you, if you're a tax exempt organisation, so that's the ACNC registered people. And then there's some more information on taxable organisations. And then finally, how to review your tax status. So what tax law basically says is that if you're following the objects of your constitution and you're not essentially running a business on the side, you're probably going to be tax-free, but you still have to check it every year because you might do things differently. If all of a sudden your U3A decided to open a restaurant with gambling in a bar, it'd be kind of cool, but you might be crossing the line then between being a not-for-profit and being subject to income tax. Sorry, I was just having a little drink. So again, how do you review it? You'll come onto this page and it'll say once a year, or where you've changed something, you have to actually go through this process. And then it'll open a form, the Income Tax Status Review Worksheet for self-assessing organisations, much more important it sounds more important than it is difficult. Is your organisation a registered charity? Yes, then you don't need to do the worksheet. If, on the other hand, you're not registered with the ACNC, then you have to go down and say, well, do you fall into one of these exempt entities? Now, I had a look thinking about U3As and what most of you do. I would suggest there's probably two categories here that fit you. One might be educational organisations, but when I looked at the definition, it didn't really fit a lot of what U3As do because it isn't necessarily formal education. But definitely you would be a community service organisation. So you'd have to have a look and sort of click one of those. And then if you do fit that, you would just put that information into the form. Do you meet all the requirements for that type of exempt entity? So are you not for profit? Have you gone through the 3 tests? And again, there's links here to all this further information. And I'd love to be able to tell you if you're a U3A, just do this. But because you're all a bit unique and you all do quite different classes and types of things in different ways, you're going to have to go through this every year yourself. But you'll see it's actually quite simple. So you'll have a look at the types of organisations and just click on that link, then go through and say, okay, you are, let's see, you're a not-for-profit and you pass one of the 3 tests. So yes, you've self-assessed your organisation as income tax exempt. And so once you've done that, you complete the form and then you keep that on file. So then if the tax office comes and asks any questions, then you would be able to say, well, we self-assessed as not-for-profit. That's really all you have to do. So it's not that scary, but definitely something you want to put in your diary as a president or secretary or treasurer to begin doing in 2023. Here we go, educational organisations. This is why I think you fit in, you might not fit in here. Is it a public educational institution? And I wasn't sure if it was or it wasn't. Does public mean anybody can go and you don't have to join? Gail might know more about that. Gail, you're muted.
We're not a registered educational institution. You're quite right, I think, to say that we would class ourselves as a community service organisation.
Right, thank you. I thought so, Gail. So here it is, community service organisation. It's a not-for-profit association. It's established for community service purposes. So you'd look at your constitution. It's not a charity, and it meets one of the three following tests. So you have to have a physical presence in Australia, or you might have DGR status. And I had a really interesting email from one of the local U3As talking about the struggle to achieve deductible gift recipient status. I think U3As would really struggle to achieve that given the guidelines that the Commission's put forward. And I couldn't find a U3A who has DGR status at the moment.
It's interesting, Leisa, that as I understand it, you have to be a charity to have DGR status. And that is one qualification that is a problem for many. If they are registered with the ACNC, they definitely are a registered charity. So if you look at the exemption checklist, it says it is not a charity.
Yes.
But so, if you are registered, if you're a U3A registered with the ACNC, then you are a registered charity.
Yes, that's right, Gail. But I suspect even for those, and there are, from what I could see in Queensland, about a third of U3As are registered charities. But then that deductible gift recipient status is one further step. And given what's required to become a DGR, I don't think U3As could meet those obligations. They're so narrow now, and they seem to be narrowing all the time. But good luck to those of you that are trying. But this is why I would suggest you're a community service organisation, and so long as you have a presence in Australia, and you do, then you would be tax exempt. So it's just, those are the three conditions. You need to meet only one. So it is, well, it is a fairly simple process. It is going to be important that you do that. So here we go, back here again. You just note that you've put this decision in front of your committee, and that's really all you have to do. Then you keep the record of that form. So if the tax office then writes to you and says they want a review and make sure that you've done that test, you would pull that form out and then send them a copy. And you would need to have a copy probably of the minutes as well, where you minuted that you signed off on your not-for-profit status year by year. So not too scary, I hope. I'm running out of time as usual, so I'm going to come back to audits and AGMs. Don't panic about the screen, because for those who need to leave, I do just quickly want to take you through the annual checklist, because this was something that Network was really keen for us to provide. And I started working on it and then realised that you've already got a really awesome checklist in the governance handbook. So I'm hoping for those of you that are new, someone has told you that this governance handbook exists. It's written by someone who's awesome. It was written by myself and a few other people, and it gives, every chapter within the book gives you a checklist. So what I've done is, rather than relying on the way the book's written, is to think about a year in your committee, in your organisation, and think about when you would when it makes sense for you to go through the checklists, I beg your pardon. So starting with your AGM, where you would do your election and signatories, and there's a section in your manual on meetings, and there's a section on your annual general meetings. So that little checklist would tell you everything you have to do before and after your AGM to make sure that you're on track. Then it was really interesting trying to work out what time during the year I would prioritise things to just give you one a month. Otherwise, you'll be inundated. So for me, the most important next step is to make sure the laws are right. So the first meeting after your AGM, I would suggest that you make sure everybody understands what laws apply to you. And in previous workshops that I'll link this to, you can have a look at what laws I think probably apply to U3As and how to find out more information about whether you're compliant. Then the next meeting, I would think you go through the checklist around committees that's in the governance handbook as well, because it will get you to answer some questions about, do you have everybody on committee that you need? Do they have now they've got a couple of months at their back. Do they need any more training? Do they have a handover? Getting a little bit into the first quarter, then looking at your volunteers and beginning some recruitment. Getting as much help as you can as you become getting active. About halfway through the year, I would be looking at the budget. So, and again, every U3A might be different. You might say, no, the most important thing we have to do straight away is get the money right. So then you just use that checklist yourself in your organisation. Then going on maybe again around that half-year period to say, well, let's review the meetings. Are they working? Are they awful? Are we doing what we said we'd do after the meetings? Thinking about the members as well in the middle of the year, touching base with them, doing any surveys, just making sure that they're relatively happy with the offerings. Then it started to get really hard for me to prioritise, but risk management, what do we have to worry about, is something I'd be looking at when everybody on the committee's got a bit more experience and the year's settled in and programs are happening, because these are the bigger areas to review. Thinking about policies, and again, in that section of the governance handbook, we've given you some guidance on what policies you really should have in place and even some template policies. Finally, towards the end of the year, maybe reviewing your strategic plan if you've got one, or doing your operational plan and budget for next year so that the incoming committee, even if it's the same bunch, have already got a roadmap as soon as they're elected. Then looking at your stakeholders, who's important, and are you keeping in good contact with them? What do they think about what you're doing? So that's reaching out to people you might get funding from. Again, talking to the members, talking to sponsors, talking to your volunteers and people who are delivering your programs. And then finally, at the end of the year, looking at constitutions, anticipating that if you want to make any changes, you're going to do that at the AGM. So hopefully you've got easy access to that document and all of those checklists. What I can do is separate the checklists out for you if you want.
Sorry, Leisa, just to make sure, because of course, when you get new people on committees, they don't always get the information, but the governance handbook and a policy bank are all on the U3A network website under resources, on the resources page.
Thanks, Gail. So if you should be able to get access to that. I think there's U3A is very good, network's very good at providing some of these things that will just help you get straight into your job without too much panic. So what I might do, because I'm already 5 minutes past, is I'm just going to very quickly cover getting ready for your AGM, because you'll be able to read it in the presentation. And I apologise, I should have managed my time better. But what I do have is some templates that I'm going to send again around how to run your AGM. And the template itself will tell you how to prepare for it. It will tell you everything that you need to do at the meeting and how you need to do it and what you need to say. And if you've never run an AGM before or you've never organised one, it will guide you through that process. And so will the stuff in the governance manual. But let me just hit 2 or 3 high points here. You need an attendance register, which is the name and signature of everyone who's at the meeting who has a right to vote. You'll need to present some reports. You'll need your financials according to your level of association. You must state your level of public liability insurance at the meeting prior to the election. You must appoint or endorse an auditor, or say you're not having one because you don't need one, and then you have to have an election. So if you don't have all of those 6 elements, you can't have an AGM. It would be better to postpone if you can't make that. And then once you get to the AGM, you'll see again all the detail in the slides. This just is going to guide you through how to run your AGM, make sure you have a quorum. So really good guidance for each of you. There's no point in me going through it in detail right now, but I do just want to make sure that if you have to have an audit, if you have to have an audit, that you get that information to the accountant as soon as you can at the end of the financial year. Remember, you've got 6 months from the end of your financial year to be able to hold your AGM, but the sooner you get the finances wrapped up and sent on to your auditor, the better. And just understand that when an auditor provides information to you, then it doesn't necessarily mean everything's all right. It might mean that they've had a look at the audit and they've got some concerns, and that's where they express it in the notes to the accounts. But again, I know there was an excellent presentation on finances at the conference this year as well. So I will include all this additional information. The only other thing, I guess, around AGMs is if you're expecting to have problems, you can set up some rules. And when everybody comes in, you just clearly state those rules. My favourite one is just everyone gets 2 minutes to say what they want, and then they're not allowed to say anything ever again. And what that helps you do is just avoid getting into a backward and forward argument. Of course, you can use any technology, but you all know that. You've probably been doing it. And this is the last slide I'll give you, which again is just how you all work together to deliver an AGM. Or to deliver a meeting. The secretary and the president do the agenda. Everybody does their operational reports. The treasurer does the financial reports. The secretary packages everything up for the meeting. You want everybody either on the committee for a committee meeting or all of the members to have read that stuff before they get there. I would definitely try and avoid reading financial reports out to the members. Give them a copy of the documents so that they can have a look at it. They're entitled to, they can get it for free anyway once they go to the Office of Fair Trading after the meeting, but much better to be open and accountable. You might choose to record the meetings. That's really up to you. The secretary or the minute secretary takes the meeting, and then everyone